We come together this morning not only in prayer, but in solidarity. It feels affirming to be together. For Birkat Hamazon, the blessing after a meal, the Mishnah teaches that when you have over 100 people gathered, you say Baruch. When you have over 1,000 people together, you say Nivarech Ladonai Eloheinu Elohei Yisrael. Let us bless the eternal, our God, the God of Israel. While we're not sharing a meal together, it feels great to know that over the course of our holidays, more than 1,000 people will celebrate with Temple Sinai. Nivarech, let us bless as a community and as a congregation. Unfortunately, part of the reason it feels so good to be together is that when times are tough and we feel threatened, we want to huddle up. We are facing unprecedented anti-Semitism in the United States. We are coming together today to pray and celebrate the Jewish New Year, but we also need to take a moment to be with one another and face a difficult reality we may not want to talk about. Anti-Semitism is an upsetting topic we must address when we look back at the past year and ahead to the new. The stabbing of Rabbi Shlomo Naginsky in Brighton this past July was a hate crime we could see coming. The Anti-Defamation League tracked a 60% increase in anti-Semitic acts last year, with over 2,000 incidents reported. As horrible as those events are, what is more insidious is the anti-Semitism that is harder to report, especially when it appears online. During the 11 days of fighting between Israel and Gaza this past summer, the words Israel and genocide were tweeted out thousands of times per hour. We saw acts of violence directed at anyone looking Jewish in cities all over the world, all in the name of supposedly being pro-Palestinian. Beating someone up isn't pro-anything. I believe that many of the people who are protesting peacefully on behalf of the Palestinians are doing so because they believe in human rights, peace, and justice, and their hearts break when they see children killed. I am happy to engage with them in dialogue. But there are others who want to see Israel, the only Jewish state in the world, wiped off the map. And when people around the world use war in Israel as an excuse to take to the streets to beat up Jews and vandalize property, that should raise an alarm to question media sources and people's true motivations. So how do we distinguish between legitimate criticism of Israel and anti-Semitism? After all, I have criticisms of Israel's government. I believe we can and should protest the extremist settlers who chant vile things, destroy property, and commit violence. They are a black eye on the face of the Jewish people. There is absolutely legitimate criticism to be had of Israeli groups and policies. Israelis have criticisms of their own government. You should read an Israeli newspaper. Israel is not a monolithic society. But can we tell the difference when someone offers a critique because they want the Jewish state to be better versus they want the Jewish state to be gone? On a call between Rabbi Rick Jacobs, president of the Union for Reform Judaism, and Jonathan Greenblatt, CEO of the Anti-Defamation League, we were taught to respond to this question with the 3D test. The 3D test was composed by Natan Sharansky, who began his career as a refusenik in the Soviet Union and has since worked as a human rights activist and politician in Israel. He knows how to recognize anti-Semitism. I'm going to quote him at some length. The so-called new anti-Semitism poses a unique challenge. Whereas classical anti-Semitism is aimed at the Jewish people or the Jewish religion, new anti-Semitism is aimed at the Jewish state. Since this anti-Semitism can hide behind the veneer of legitimate criticism of Israel, it is more difficult to expose. Making the task even harder is that this hatred is advanced in the names of values most of us would consider unimpeachable, such as human rights. Nevertheless, we must be clear and outspoken in exposing the new anti-Semitism. I believe we can apply a simple test, I call it the 3D test, to help distinguish legitimate criticism of Israel from anti-Semitism. The first D is the test of demonization. When the Jewish state is being demonized, when Israel's actions are blown out of all sensible proportion, when comparisons are made between Israelis and Nazis, and between Palestinian refugee camps and Auschwitz, this is anti-Semitism, not legitimate criticism of Israel. The second D is the test of double standards. When criticism of Israel is applied selectively, when Israel is singled out by the United Nations for human rights abuses, while the behavior of known and major abusers, such as China, Iran, Cuba, and Syria, is ignored, this is anti-Semitism. The third D is the test of delegitimization. When Israel's fundamental right to exist is denied, alone among all peoples in the world, this too is anti-Semitism. We can use Sharansky's 3D test, demonization, double standards, and delegitimization, as we watch the news and read what is online. Sometimes it is not what is being said, but how. When Jewish students on college campuses are given fake eviction notices in their dorm rooms, or cartoons show Jews with large noses, or insinuations are made about Jewish money and international influence, straight out of the protocols of the elders of Zion, that is anti-Semitism in how something is being presented. As always, anti-Semitism is a matter of projection. In the 20th century, socialists accused Jews of being merciless capitalists, and capitalists thought of Jews as subversive socialists. Today, anti-Semitism in the US has morphed into different projections. According to Rabbi Meszler at Zioness, if you ask the neo-Nazis who marched in Charlottesville, Jews are the primary threat to white supremacy and who are perverting the white race. If you ask anti-Zionists, they will tell you that Jews are the white supremacists of the Middle East and also the primary beneficiaries of white privilege. The latter, of course, ignores the existence of Jews of color. We become villainized in both directions. Therefore, when it comes to facing anti-Semitism today, we are going to need some wisdom. We are going to need when to call someone out and when to call someone in. The 3D test will help us decide when we have to protest and marginalize voices of hate, and when there is an opportunity for dialogue and we have to engage with people with whom we disagree. I want to focus on the last part, which is calling someone in. It is easier to call someone out, to block them on Facebook, or to say that this person will never change and talking to them is a waste of time. It is harder when an organization you trust suddenly puts out a one-sided statement blaming everything on Israel, or a cause you believe in or a product you enjoy suddenly joins BDS, the Boycott, Divest, and Sanction movement. BDS explicitly calls for replacement of Israel with a Palestinian state and is anti-Semitic. Calling people in requires using your relationships to sit at the same table and try to change hearts and minds. Calling in may be harder work than calling out, but it is preferable. It is much better to change an opponent to a partner than to give up hope on someone. And often the result of a dialogue is not so clear-cut or satisfying. There are places where we agree and places where we disagree. Where we have to draw the line is when people demonize, apply double standards, and delegitimize Israel. That is treating Israel as the pariah Jew among nations. And of course, when we are physically attacked, when our buildings and cemeteries are covered in graffiti and Jewish people are beaten up in the streets, we have to stand together. I also have to address an internal problem we have, which is partisan politics. Members of each political party like to claim that the anti-Semites who belong to the other party are the worst. It's like people saying, yeah, I know there are anti-Semites in my party, but they aren't really representative. Those guys over there are the real problem. Let's not argue over whose anti-Semites are worse. Let's respond to all anti-Semitism wherever it can be found. Or maybe liberals should focus on anti-Semitism coming from progressives, and conservatives should focus on anti-Semitism coming from the right. In that spirit, anyone who knows me knows that I've been involved in causes for racial justice. I believe in racial justice and civil rights, and I will never stop protesting against racism. But that is why it is especially painful to me when racial justice gets co-opted into demonizing Israel. So I feel I need to give what should be an obvious fact check here and now. To my friends who have protested against the state of Israel as white colonization oppressing people of color, please think about the meaning of those words. First, Israelis are not white. They are 70% Jews, 20% Arabs, and 10% other minorities. Of the Jewish population, more than half are Mizrahi, Jews from Arab lands, whose families were expelled from Arab countries. There are also Sephardi and Ethiopian Jews and Jews through conversion and adoption of every race and color. So this is not about white people oppressing people of color. Second, the state of Israel is not a colony. The Jewish people who came from Europe and Arab lands to Israel weren't coming in the name of their countries of origin to settle a foreign land. They didn't come to settle the land in the name of Russia, Poland, Iraq, or Syria. They were refugees fleeing anti-Semitism who were coming back to their historic home. The very concept of the people Israel is that we are one of the indigenous peoples of the land of Israel. To quote Elon Stricker, Boston director of AIPAC, indigenous does not have an expiration date. If you were to go back in time and interview the original Zionists like Theodore Herzl, they would tell you that Zionism is our liberation movement. So this conflict is demonstrably not a racial or colonial issue. This is a conflict over territory between two indigenous peoples, both of whom have also been refugees, and Palestinian and Israeli human rights. It is an argument over the very existence of the Jewish state, how to deal with terrorist organizations embedded in a civilian population, and ultimately the safety, opportunity, and dignity of all. Now, one can disagree with this assessment and still not be an anti-Semite. But when the white colonization argument is paired with chants of, from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free, then we are dealing with rhetoric that is dangerous. That is a call for the annihilation of Israel. And let's all please be humble. The catastrophe unfolding in Afghanistan should give us a reality check about the Middle East. I can't help but wonder what would happen if Israel completely withdrew from the West Bank, as they did in Lebanon in 2000 and Gaza in 2005. Many people today insist Israel do so in the name of peace and human rights, but no one seems to want to confront the chaos that would follow. Today, Hezbollah is in Lebanon, Hamas is in Gaza, and now the Taliban is in Kabul. While the situations between Afghanistan and Israel are different, the reality of a Taliban-like force waiting in the wings to move in is the same. The main difference is that instead of being thousands of miles away, in the case of Israel and its enemies, we are talking about just a few miles. One would hope that critics could logically apply what we are seeing on the news in Afghanistan to Israel. What do you do when you can't stay and you can't leave? And to make life more complicated, what do you do when people are shooting at your family from behind children, or stockpile rockets in homes, or try to sneak suicide bombers into your airports and buses? Seriously, what do you do? And how can anyone dare excuse these crimes as the acts of freedom fighters? Are such voices simply ignorant, or is something more sinister going on? When Palestinian aggression is excused and every act of Israel is condemned, we are dealing in dangerous double standards. Make no mistake, defense of Israel does not give a free pass to all settlers or the radical Israeli right. However, in terms of the larger context and how difficult it is, let's understand the real situation and what is at stake. In the past, when even the most liberal Israeli leaders said any two-state solution must include security, this is what they are talking about. In light of these challenges, we should celebrate that the Anti-Defamation League and the Union for Reform Judaism have announced a new partnership. The partnership will be multifaceted. It will include a digital incident reporting mechanism, online and print resources tailored to each community, a new collaboration with the ADL and URJ youth team. We especially need to give support to our college students who are often facing a difficult challenge of propaganda on campus. And if you are struggling with mixed feelings about Israel's presence in the West Bank, you are not alone. When I talk to my Israeli friends who live outside of Gaza or in Jerusalem, they share your feelings and also want a solution. All I ask is that you stay in relationship to Israel. You can have criticisms of countries you love. It's the same with the United States. It is hard to embrace complexity. So seek out Israelis and Israeli causes that represent your values and support them. Be engaged, but also be wary of anti-Semitic tropes and stereotypes. Not everyone's criticism is legitimate. I don't believe that anti-Semitism will ever completely go away. I do believe, however, that we are not powerless. We have wisdom, using Sharansky's 3D test, and we have allies. We also have each other. Nivarech, we shall bless. We need to support and celebrate life in Israel, and here, Am Yisrael Chai, the Jewish people lives. Shana Tova.